Now it's time to make the PCR for the peanut preparation department. And to do so, you're going to need information about the physical flow of actual units that came through inventory. So for this department, we realized that they had enough peanuts that they were working on at the beginning of the period to make 8,000 cases of peanut butter. During this month, they started another 42,000 cases worth of peanuts in production. And during the month, they transferred out 40,000 cases worth of peanuts to the next phase of production. So they fully prepared the peanuts, they shelled them, they roasted them, all of that stuff, and sent them off to the next phase in production that'll turn them into actual jars of peanut butter. For ending WIP, we'll figure out the number of units are shortly when we get to the actual PCR. But those units that are an ending work in process for Chewy Easy Peanut Butter are complete for direct material. So all of the raw peanuts are there to be prepared. They're just not fully prepared yet. They still need to be blanched and roasted and all of that stuff. So they're only 25% done for their conversion costs, their labor costs, and their overhead costs. And then for our cost section, we know how much in materials and conversion costs was already committed to our beginning work in process when the period began. We know how much we spent on production costs during the period, $130,200, and we know how much we added for conversion costs in terms of labor and overhead allocated during the same month of July. And with this, we have enough information to make our PCR for the peanut preparation department. We're going to start with the physical units section. We're going to figure out how many cases worth of peanuts we had at all times, and we got to figure out from there where they lie. So let's start with what we had in beginning WIP. Our information tells us they had 8,000 cases worth of peanuts in beginning WIP, and that during the month they started the production of another 42,000 cases worth of peanuts, which means all in all 50,000 cases worth of peanuts came through the peanut preparation department during the month of July. Well, where are they? Well, we know right here that we transferred out 40,000 cases worth of peanuts to the next phase of production to be made into actual peanut butter. And if there were 50,000 cases in this department during the entire period, and we know 40,000 of those were transferred out to the next phase of production, the remaining 10,000 have to still be being prepared in Chewy Easy Peanut Butter's peanut preparation department when the period ended, which makes our ending WIP 10,000 units. But if we know we transferred out 40,000 and we're still working on the other 10,000, we've accounted for all 50,000 cases. And that's a rule of thumb for our production costing report. The total units to account for have to be equal to the total units that were accounted for, and ours are. We know where all 50,000 cases worth of peanuts that came through this department lie at the end of the period. The portion of them that was transferred to the next phase of production and the portion that's still here. The other side of this physical units section is going to use what they call EUP, equivalent units of production. They measure the cost of partially completed units in terms of completed units. It would be a nightmare to do the math for this if we said, okay, we transferred out X amount of units that were fully done, then we had Y amount of units that were 20% done, and then Z amount of units that were only 5% done. The math would get incredibly complicated. So on a production costing report, you convert things into equivalent units, and you're basically saying we completed some units and some units are partially completed, but for the same cost that it took to partially complete those units at the end of the period that are in our ending WIP, we could have fully completed this many cases worth of peanuts. So you need to know how complete they are for your two cost categories, your direct materials and your conversion costs, and then take how many actual physical units are in your ending WIP, multiply that by how complete they are, and you get how many units you could have completed from start to finish for the same cost that it took you to complete that many units. So back to our PCR over here, let's start filling in our equivalent unit section. You don't use the top to account for. You don't have to worry about that. Your numbers are all going to sit down here in the bottom section of this. And let's start with the direct material cost of units that were completed and transferred out. If the peanut preparation department sent off these peanuts to the second phase of production to be made into actual peanut butter, they've got to be done for all of their direct materials. They've got to be done for their conversion costs. They've got to be done for everything that this department does to properly prepare peanuts to be made into peanut butter. Because if they weren't done for all of the things in the first phase of production, we would have never sent them off to the second phase of production. So if we're completed and transferred out, your equivalent units are always going to be equal to your physical units because they have to be complete for that particular cost. The same is not true for ending WIP, but in this case, it will be 10,000. Now, why is it 10,000? Because those 10,000 physical units that are in our ending inventory are 100% complete for direct materials. So in total, our equivalent units for direct materials is 50,000. Moving on to conversion costs for completed and transferred out, same rule applies. All of the labor and overhead that had to go into properly preparing peanuts must have happened if we finish these units and transfer them out. So this whole row is always going to just be the same number. All of your completed and transferred out units will have the same amount of equivalent units as they do physical units, but the same is not true for your ending WIP. Those 10,000 physical units that we have, the 10,000 cases worth of peanuts in this peanut preparation department that we're working on when the period ended, are only 25% complete for their conversion costs. So let's convert that into terms of equivalent units. How many units we could have completed start to finish for the same cost that it took us to complete 10,000 units 25% of the way. And that's exactly what you do. You just multiply the physical units that you have in your ending inventory times how complete they are for that particular cost component. And to complete 10,000 units 1/4 of the way, we could have completed 2,500 units start to finish for that same cost, which means our total equivalent units for this department's conversion cost is 42,500. For the same amount of money that we spent in labor and overhead to complete 40,000 units all the way and complete 10,000 units 1/4 of the way, we could have completed 42,500 units from start to finish. When we get to the bottom half of this table, the cost table, we're going to be talking about equivalent units of production. That's these numbers. These are the numbers that you're always going to be referencing. So when we use equivalent units of production in our calculations, say for ending WIP, these are the figures that we're going to want to reference here in the bottom half of this table. Now we're in the cost section. So we're not talking about the quantity of cases of peanuts that we have, but the actual cost that went into preparing those peanuts. Well, our beginning WIP for direct materials already had $9,800 worth of costs committed to it. And then our information tells us that during this month of July, we spent another $130,200 to acquire raw peanuts, which were to be prepared and made into properly prepared peanuts. So all in all, that's $140,000. We need to divide that by how many cases worth of peanuts we could prepare for that $140,000, our equivalent units of production. And for our equivalent units of production, it was 50,000 because we had 40,000 cases that got transferred out. The 10,000 cases in our ending WIP were fully complete for materials. That's 50,000 cases worth of material costs. So $140,000 in costs spread across 50,000 cases is $2.80. Preparing a case worth of peanuts to be made into a case of peanut butter costs us about $2.80 to acquire those raw peanuts in the first place. Let's do the same thing for conversion costs. The units that were in beginning WIP already had $3,910 worth of labor and overhead committed to them. During the period, we had labor costs and we allocated overhead, and all in all, that totaled up to $64,090 worth of conversion costs. So all of the peanuts that came through the peanut preparation department during the period had a total of $68,000 of conversion costs committed to them. Well, what's our equivalent units of production? And that's the number that we took from the bottom line up on the top half of this chart. It was 42,500. One more time, we had 40,000 cases that were complete and transferred out. The 10,000 cases that were in our ending WIP were only 25% done. So for the same cost that it took to complete most of the cases and partially complete some of the cases, we could have completed 42,500 cases start to finish. And you want that because this cost per equivalent unit is a rate thing. It's how much it costs in labor and overhead to properly prepare one case worth of peanuts. And 68,000 divided by 45,000 is going to give us $1.60. So preparing a case worth of peanuts costs us $1.60 in labor and overhead costs. So for our total over here, we're going to use these top three spots. The beginning WIP had $9,800 in material costs and $3,910 in conversion costs already committed to it. Therefore, the peanuts in the peanut preparation department when the month of July began had $13,710 worth of costs already committed to them. During the period, we spent $130,200 on materials and $64,090 on conversion costs. So we added a total of $194,290 worth of costs to these peanuts. So what are our total costs to account for? Well, we had a certain amount already committed. We added more during the period. The sum of those two numbers, which in this case is $208,000, which is also the sum of these two numbers, so you can check your math that way. That $208,000 is how much we got to figure out where it lies. We got to figure out how much of that $208,000 should be transferred on to the next phase of production, and how much of it should still be contained here in our ending WIP. Well, let's do that in our costs accounted for section down on the bottom. For our direct materials, what was the equivalent units of production for cases that were completed and transferred out? Again, you would take this from the chart on the top up here, but we transferred out 40,000 cases. We know all 40,000 cases were fully complete for material costs, and we know that each case costs us $2.80 in material. So those 40,000 cases at a rate of $2.80 a piece is $112,000 worth of material costs that went into preparing peanuts for Chew Easy peanut butter. What about the units that are in ending WIP? Well, we had 10,000 cases in our ending WIP. And those 10,000 cases in our ending WIP were fully complete for our material costs during the period. So that was the equivalent units of production that we had. Each unit, again, cost $2.80 in material costs, which means our ending WIP that we have right now already has $28,000 worth of material costs added to it. And that comes into our chart under ending WIP. And then in total, just add those two together. It's $140,000. And here is our first spot where we can see that our numbers line up. We had to account for $140,000 worth of material costs. We did account for $140,000 worth of material costs. Of that $140,000 that Chew Easy Peanut Butter spent in the peanut preparation department for materials, $112,000 of it went into cases that were completed and transferred out, and therefore that cost should be transferred over to the next phase of production. While $28,000 of it is tied up in cases of peanuts that we are still in the process of preparing when this month ended. And then we're going to apply the same concept over here to our conversion cost. So we completed and transferred out 40,000 cases worth of peanuts. Again, they had to be done for all of the necessary labor and overhead costs that are incurred in the peanut preparation department, or we would have never transferred them out. And our cost per completed equivalent unit for conversion costs, we've already calculated to be $1.60, which means those 40,000 cases at a rate of $1.60 per case cost us $64,000 in conversion costs to complete. What about the units in ending WIP? Well, Chew Easy, in its peanut preparation department, has 10,000 units in their ending WIP. But those 10,000 units are only 25% done for all of the conversion costs that need to go into them, all the labor and overhead costs of shelling, roasting, properly preparing those peanuts, which means to complete 10,000 units, 25% of the way, we could have made 2,500 units from start to finish. And we know that fully preparing a case worth of peanuts costs us $1.60 in conversion costs. So 2,500 times 160 is 4,000. And you throw that into your chart, and then you add the costs that went into units that were completed and transferred out, and the costs that are contained in your ending WIP for this department, and it comes out to $68,000. And again, our numbers line up. We know where those $68,000 worth of conversion costs lie. $64,000 of that went into cases which we completed and transferred off to the next phase of production, and therefore the $64,000 of cost needs to be transferred with those cases as they move down the production line, while the remaining $4,000 is tied up in the cases that are still a work in process when July ends for Chew Easy. So all in all, we completed and transferred $176,000 worth of costs, and this number is very important. No matter how many phases of production that you have, the cost completed and transferred out of one phase will always be transferred into the next phase that it goes to. So we're going to do the PCR for the second phase of production later on in these videos, and there's going to be a spot where it says cost transferred in. Well, what amount of cost is getting transferred in to the second phase of production? The same amount of cost that's getting transferred out of the first phase of production. That $176,000 is the amount of cost that needs to get passed on to the second phase of production when these properly prepared peanuts are passed off to be made into peanut butter. The remaining $32,000 is tied up in WIP that is still in this department at the end of the period. But still, if we transferred out $176,000 worth of costs, and we're keeping $32,000 worth of costs in this department on their PCR to be the beginning WIP for next period, we've accounted for the full $208,000. And just like above, these numbers have to match. If your total costs to account for aren't equal to your total costs accounted for, you're missing money. And it's something disappeared off of your books as you were passing it along the line. But we're good right now because we know those two numbers match.